Hello everyone, it's great to see you all here this evening for this talk on Alexandria. And there are many things to say about Alexandria, but one area that I want to focus on is the ability people had to live together in a peaceful way and how they were able to tolerate each other's differences. And there was a time in history where tolerance wasn't a political correctness tool, but it was more a way of life, an approach to life. And for me, Alexandria was a good model of this. Was it perfect? Of course not. No society is ever perfect, but it demonstrated a deep understanding of an ability to tolerate others and to understand others. And for me, for society then, as for today, tolerance is one of those qualities to help people face and overcome the crises that arise in life. And today, as we all know, we're going through a number of crises. In the last few weeks, there's examples of racism in the United States, global warming, pollution, the ongoing wars around the world. But are these brand new issues? Are these issues we faced in the past? And I think we have. Humanity has faced these issues in the past. And we can learn from history. And there are, in general, two different ways of learning from history. Two different views of history. One is that history is linear, it's progressing in an inclined line, and that if we just wait long enough, that everything will reach a state of near perfection. And in this view, we don't learn from the past, or we don't need to learn from the past, because we have all the knowledge and wisdom today. That's one view. Another view that I find very interesting and more formative is that history is cyclical. And there is an inclination, there is, I think, a progression, but within that progression, there are times of high points and low points. Times when humanity were able to learn from the past, were able to live timeless values and principles, but through time, they've forgotten how to live these principles, and there was a decline. A civilization declined, the civilization fell, and it rose again. So in this idea of cyclical history, there's an opportunity to learn from the past. And I know today we have advanced technology, we have our smartphones, we have this fantastic Google Meet where we can talk to each other, but there is also things in the past that people were able to do better. And one example of that is Alexandria, where they set us an example of how to tolerate each other. And when we look at history, it's to understand, for me, what's important is to look at the ideas, the values that underlies the expressions, and it's to learn from those ideas and timeless values so we can put them into practice for today. My focus is not so much the how, but it's the why and the timeless values that underlay that. So, with that in mind, today we're going to look at Alexandria and see what its history can teach us. And I'll start by looking at its founder, Alexander the Great, and the line of his the rulers that succeeded him, that shared that vision of Alexandria. And we explore some of the great engineers, the mathematicians, and the inventors, and we try and look at the school of philosophy that had its origin in Alexandria, which was called Neoplatonism. And Neoplatonism was an approach, a more eclectic approach to philosophy, where it looks at the different expressions, the different visions of truth, and it takes the best from all of those, combines them into a whole. And then finally, I'm going to try to understand more what tolerance is. And to help us to understand that, I'm going to look first at fanaticism, to understand what fanaticism is. And that'll help us understand what tolerance is. And finally, I'm going to look at the value of solidarity, because tolerance is one step in a path towards solidarity. So we can live together in a more fraternal way. We can learn from, we can understand what unites us, but also at the same time to understand what our differences are. So in this talk, I may say a few things you disagree with. I hope you can tolerate me. And maybe at the end of the talk, we can come to a common understanding. And maybe not. Maybe at the end of the talk, you'll still disagree with me, but that's okay, because we can agree to disagree, and that's a form of tolerance. So let's start with history a little bit, to understand the history. And we need to start with the figure of Alexander of Macedonia, or Alexander the Great, as he is commonly known. And it's difficult, maybe even controversial, to discuss a historical figure like Alexander the Great when we're talking about tolerance, because he's known for conquering different cultures and different people. But if we try to understand the context of the time, the context people lived in, it'll give us, I think, a different vision of Alexander and his campaign. And Alexander his focus wasn't on to destroy civilization, but to give civilization a new impetus, a new direction. And when Alexander conquered other people, he adopted their cultures, embraced the different outlooks, and raised the former enemies to his ranks. And he was famous for welcoming the opponents on the battlefield with honor and dignity. So it's a very different way of looking at history. Now, I'm not trying to justify war or invasion, but to understand the context of the time. It's a little bit like today in the 21st century. How are people going to see us in 2,000 years from now? They'll need to understand the challenges we were facing, to understand our history, the values we had, to understand why things happen and why things were going in a certain direction. So 332 BC, while Alexander was on his campaign, he was welcomed into Egypt. So he invaded Egypt, but he was actually welcomed in because the ruler at that time was Darius III of Persia. And the Egyptians, they didn't really like Darius because he wasn't a very just ruler. So they welcomed Alexander in, and Alexander decided to set up the capital of his empire there. And he set his engineers about building the new Alexandria. And within a short period of time, Alexander headed off on his campaign to the east, to India, and he never saw the final finishing touches to Alexandria. And he would die at the age, 9 years later at the age of 32. Alexander was a kind of a force of cohesion within his empire. And when he died, the internal frictions and forces divided his empire. And one of his closest friends and closest generals, Ptolemy, decided to head to Egypt and take control of the empire there. And eventually he was able to take possession of Alexander's body and bury it in Alexandria. And when Alexandria is along the coast of the Mediterranean, not to the left of the delta, and the location was well picked because there was an island there they can use to set up a large harbor, and it was a great place for ships to enter and to do trade. So the location was at a great trading point between east and the west. And Ptolemy, when he arrived there and started to take the rule of Egypt and Alexandria, he set about not only focusing on military matters and economic matters, but he wanted to make Alexandria a place for trading in knowledge, to trading in different ideas, because he shared the same vision as Alexander of the importance of knowledge and importance of wisdom. So he set about setting up the great library of Alexandria and the great museum. So the library in Alexandria, he started to invest a lot of time and resources in forming the library and the museum. And he set about trying to collect as many books as he could, or many books or scrolls or papyrus as he could, so to fill the library shelves. And it was interesting, people who wanted to study there or enter the library had to bring a book that the library didn't have. So it was a kind of like a way of admission into the library. And back then they didn't have photocopying machines that can just, quickly photocopy a book. They had to take a book and scribe it onto papyrus. So with time, it became the largest known library in the world. And it contained between 100,000, maybe to 400,000 papyrus scrolls. That's an estimate. So when Ptolemy died, he made sure his son, Ptolemy II, had a shared vision of Alexandria, a place of knowledge, of wisdom, a place of investigation. So, and he also helped make Alexandria a great, very wealthy city, because in Egypt they had a lot of grain, and a lot of people wanted grain for food. So they could exchange, it was a great exchange of money and also ideas. And he helped set up the lighthouse there on the island of the Faroe Island. Things started to go downhill with Ptolemy IV onwards. He wasn't a very good ruler. He was more interested in enjoying himself and spending the great wealth of Alexandria. And it went on like that until the reign of Cleopatra. And Cleopatra was the first female Ptolemy and the last. And she gained the throne in 51 BC. And it was a time in history where it was the kind of the end of Alexandria, because on the other side of the Mediterranean, the Roman Empire was gaining more power, and they saw Alexandria as a potential threat. And with the war that was happening in between Julius Caesar and Pompey, things went downhill, and it ended up being a civil war in Alexandria as well. And Cleopatra eventually died. So that's a short history of the political history of Alexandria. Another aspect that I think is very interesting of Alexandria is the museum. And when we think of a museum today, we see it as a place we go to learn about different cultures, different their art, their engineering, and their way of life. But in Alexandria, the museum had a different purpose. The word museum comes from a Greek word that means seat of the muses. And the muses were gods of inspiration for the different artists, of the different arts. And they were a source of creativity, wisdom, and insight. So the museum was a place of discovery, learning, research, to gain insight into the laws of life. So it's like kind of a university into the principles and laws of life, describe it in a different way. And some of the notable figures there, I'll just mention a few, because there's loads. One that I'll mention is Euclid, and he was a father of geometry. Those of you who didn't like maths at school, you can blame him for the challenges. But he wrote an influential book called The Elements, and he didn't create maths, he didn't create geometry, but what he did was he was able to take all that knowledge from around the known world, systematize it, and put it in a coherent framework, and expand the knowledge and create rigorous mathematical proofs. Another figure was Eratosthenes, and he is best known for his calculations of the circumference of the Earth and the diameter of the Earth. By using simple mathematics, intelligence, and a stick, he was able to do that. It's a phenomenal feat. And he was able to calculate the tilt of the Earth. So he was a mathematician, a philosopher as well, and he was involved in a museum. Another one that you may know of is Archimedes. He was a mathematician and inventor, and you may have heard of the Archimedes screw. It's a device for sucking or extracting water and to irrigate fields. So it's kind of like a tube structure with a kind of spiral inside of it that was able to extract water. So for then, back then, that was a huge technological advancement. And another one is pulleys that he used to understand how to use different pulleys to lift weight. The last one was Heron, and he was a mathematician and engineer, and he investigated steam-powered devices. And even back then, they knew the power of steam. There are many other figures I could talk about, but short of time. So as you can see, there was a lot of mathematical, engineering, and technological advancements at the time in Alexandria, over 2,000 years ago. But why was it lost? Why was all that information and knowledge lost? A lot of that during the Dark Ages, a lot of that information, a lot of that knowledge was lost and was rediscovered during the time of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment in the 14th century. But why was it lost? And one reason was the lack of tolerance. So tolerance is the ability to accept behaviors, views, different ways of life where we don't agree with. And during the 3rd and 4th century onwards, there was a rise of religious fanaticism in Alexandria and around the Mediterranean world. And a fanatic is a person who who has one view of life, and they think or believe that view is the only view and the right view, and all other views are wrong. But there's not only religious fanatics, there's fanatics in politics, where they think one party is the most just and everything else is unjust. There's fanatics in science, which seems a bit paradoxical because science is supposed to be open to different views, different theories. But some scientists are so invested in their theory of life, or theory of the emotion, or theory of the physical world, that they're blinded by that, and they can't see that no theory can explain the full complexity of life. Thomas Kuhn, a scientist, wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolution, and he explains this thing in science, this fanatical behavior in scientists. And a friend of mine, she's an artist, and she explained to me as well that some artists can be fanatics as well, which was news to me. That one particular expression of art is the most beautiful, and all the rest are ugly. So a fanatic is a person who has a very fixed and rigid view of life, and a fanatic is incapable to tolerate different views. So in the 3rd and 4th century onwards in Alexandria, religious fanaticism arose, which they believed that the research and learning in the museum was blasphemous, which ultimately contributed to its downfall and destruction. And there is a film, you may know it, called Agora, that captures this time of crisis in Alexandria with religious fanatics. And one of the main protagonists or heroes in the movie is called Agora. It's called Hypatia, and she was a Neoplatonist philosopher. And what she taught in her lectures and was not accepted by religious fanatics. So she was ultimately put to death for it. So that's fanaticism that arose in Alexandria in its down during the time later on in Alexandria. But what is tolerance, though? We understand now what fanatics is, but what is tolerance and what is solidarity? To help us understand that question, I'm going to look at a school of philosophy that had its origin in Alexandria called Neoplatonism. And it emerged in the 3rd century AD. And it was a school of philosophy that was a fusion of Eastern and Western thought. And it was a synthesis of different teachings into a more organic whole. And it was a dialogue between different traditions encouraged by its founder, Ammonius Saccas. And it was a dialogue where everybody could learn from each other. No idea was excluded simply because they were different. And the possibility was always open that someone else could learn or could understand nature and could contribute to that understanding of the whole. And one of the key ideas explained in Neoplatonism was the principle of unity. They explain that the universe is one. And by the way, the word universe comes from the Latin word that means turned into one. And they explain that there was one direction in the universe and that we're all heading towards it. And that in our essence, all human beings are one. In our essence, we're all the same. And different traditions give those things different names. Some traditions call it spirit. And in the Greek tradition, they call it nous. In Tibet, they call it inner voice. And they also explain that there's one truth, but people have different opinions on what is true due to the closeness or distance away from the truth. But there was only one truth. There's no multiple truths or multiple facts, as some people say today. There's only one truth. To help us understand that idea of truth, I'm going to use an example or analogy. And the famous lighthouse in Alexandria was 40 stories high, and it used a kind of a bronze surface to reflect the light. And when the sailors at nighttime were trying to sail to Alexandria, if they were very far away from the coast, or from the lighthouse, the light was very faint. And they could only see, as a result, they could see nothing in the darkness. They couldn't see themselves, they couldn't see their fellow sailors, and they couldn't see the environment around them. But as they got closer to the light, they could see more clearly. They could see themselves, they could start working together with other people, they could start directing themselves in the sea better because the light was allowing them to see. And the truth is like the light of the lighthouse. The further we are away from the truth, the less clearly we can see things, the less mental clarity we have. We cannot agree between ourselves about things because we don't have the light of truth to help us. But when we get closer to the truth, we can start to gain more mental clarity. As the Buddhists would say, we gain a little bit more enlightenment, and we start to see things better. We start to discover that the one truth exists inside myself, the one truth exists inside others, but it also exists in nature as well. We can see the connectivity that connects everything together. You hear people saying, I see what you mean, because we're able to see things and what connects us together. But what stops us from seeing the truth? What stops the sailor from seeing the lighthouse, do you think? Well, clouds. Clouds obstruct the vision of the lighthouse. But what do those clouds look like inside of us? What stops us from seeing the truth? What do you think? Anybody hazard a guess? Well, it could be our fears, it could be our doubts, it could be our prejudices. They could be preconceived ideas. So there's a lot of things, those sorts of things that stops us from seeing what's true. That stops us from connecting to what's universal inside myself, inside others. And if there's one truth, why are there so many differences? Well, to help understand this, I'm going to use the example of my hand. We can see, or you can look at your own hand as well, that you can see that there are many different fingers, there are different sizes, there's different positions, there's different shapes, but at the same time, they have something in common. They have the different function the same way, they have the different same internal structure, and they work together as one. But what happens if one of the fingers says, I can't tolerate that other finger anymore? What happens? It just annoying me. Well, the hand won't work anymore. But this is what happens in the body as well when someone gets cancer. A cell can't tolerate anymore the differences between the other cells. It forgets about the unity, and it starts to multiply to the detriment of the whole health of the body. So to be tolerant is to accept that there are differences, like the different fingers. There are different forms, there are different ways of doing things, and there are different expressions. There's an expression, live and let live, and it might sound simple, but it's not easy, because our ego doesn't like differences. There's a part of ourselves that doesn't like our comforts being disturbed, either physically, emotionally, mentally. And the ego likes to think that it knows best. The ego says things like, I know my way is the right way, my opinion is the right one, my art, my religion, my particular party is the right one, and the other ones are wrong. And we all have egos. And most of this behavior of the ego is unconscious to us. And we've been formatted in a certain way that we don't realize. And the Neoplatonists suggest that by observing ourselves to see the behavior of the ego, we can observe it and the possibility to correct it, to realize, to help us overcome these unnecessary judgments. And if we see it, it's not to beat ourselves up about it. It's not to be too judgmental about ourselves, because that's been our, formatting for a long time in our society. Because if we don't see them, we can't modify them. And what I'm talking about here doesn't happen overnight. To understand ourselves, to get to know ourselves, it doesn't happen with one talk or over a weekend. It's a long process of education. And philosophers from East and West traditions suggest that it's better to do it together with a group, with people like-minded people who want to overcome their challenges, to overcome the clouds within themselves. And it's better to do this with people who have experienced it and who are doing it for a long time. So tolerance is to accept the rights to have a different view, to permit or to accept different views, even though we don't accept them. And socially, this is what sometimes tolerance can be thinking of as putting up with other people. We can endure them. We can endure the different views. But there's a challenge or limitation with tolerance is that what happens when we get bothered by others? I know at the moment we're in isolation because of the pandemic, but at some stage we're going to get back together again. We're going to start being in groups again. We're going to go back to our work colleagues. There's going to be, and when we get back with other people that have different views or opinions, what happens? What emerges? There's going to be conflicts, disagreements. It's going to be an annoyance. And if we just put up with differences, what's going to happen is eventually we're going to lose patience, or we start to isolate ourselves from others, which is not the best thing to do. So the challenge with tolerance is to understand the differences, to understand our differences, but also to understand what connects us. Because we tend to focus a lot on the differences, and we don't focus on what unites us. And it's the example of the hand. We tend to focus on the different fingers, but we don't focus on what unites us. And we focus on the differences. And the Neoplatonists suggest that we have a lot more in common than what differentiates us. We have what we have in common is it's a huge amount compared to our differences. Our differences are very small. They're very superficial. But what unites us is huge. I'm sure many of you are here today because you want to understand how we can create a better society, how we can be more tolerant of differences in our society and different people, different ideas. We have the same concerns as people. We're inspired by the same vision, the same similar values. So, and as people who go through the same life experiences, with the same joys and everything. So what connects us more is we have a lot of things that connect us more than differentiates us. But the challenge is we tend to focus more on what differentiates us. And if we focus more on what unites us, to understand the one truth, the one spirit, one essence that we have, then we can understand our differences better, because the differences are different expressions of the one underlying unity or underlying truth. And by understanding the differences, they can enrich your experiences. They're not a source of conflict anymore, but a source of understanding. They enrich us. And when we start to see what unites us more, we can start embracing the quality of solidarity. Because solidarity, it's to see what unites us beyond our differences. And that's the next phase or the next step towards helping create a more fraternal society. Because being tolerant alone is not going to create the change I think we all want to see alone. There has to be an element of what unites us. So in conclusion, Alexandria is a model today that can help us understand tolerance a little bit more. It's a short talk and it's a very broad subject, but I think it's a good start. And tolerance is one of the values we need today in facing a crisis. And for me, the word crisis is a very interesting word. It comes from the Greek words that means turning point. And when we face a crisis, it's an opportunity to learn from the crisis. It's an opportunity to understand what caused the crisis, to understand what were the motors, the movements that led to the crisis in the first place. And if we learn from those lessons, then we can change the direction. We can turn it around and go in a more positive direction. And crises are part of life. We all go through crisis, individually and collectively. It's part of growing up. But what's not natural is to avoid a crisis. It's not natural to ignore it, to pretend it's not there, to avoid it, but to face it head on and to see, what is this experience telling me? And I think some of the challenges we're facing today in our society is because we haven't fundamentally learned from the crisis. We haven't been able to extract the lessons and put them into practice to really to change things around. And in the talk, I talked about kind of 3 steps or 3 phases that will help turn around the crisis. And one of them is to understand fanaticism. And a fanatic is a person who has an inability to see another person's point of view and to think that their view is right and the other person's is wrong. And I was watching something on the internet the other night, and it was a reporter interviewing a Donald Trump supporter. They're asking him, why do you support Donald Trump? And they gave their reasons. And the reporter at the end of the interview asked, no matter what Donald Trump does, would you always support him? And they said yes. So no matter what he does, they'll always support Donald Trump. And for me, that I was surprised, and maybe I'm a little bit naive, but I didn't realize that there was that level of kind of fanatical behavior still around. But to move beyond fanaticism, we need to accept that there are different views, that there are different perspectives. And the next phase is to become tolerant and accept the differences. And it's to accept that there are many different colors, there are many different expressions, different points of views. And I think collectively as humanity, we're starting to see that more, and we can see that in the last few weeks, that more and more people are accepting that, which is a fantastic event. But I think we need to go further, because it's not to stay in tolerance alone. Because the last thing we need to awaken and develop in our society is solidarity. Because we can tolerate each other's differences, we can put up with them, but there can be a separation between us. Once there's something that we need that unites us, that brings us together both in heart and mind, that creates a concord between us. And philosophically, we're saying that what is universal in us, in myself and others, that unites us. I talked about the lighthouse and the truth. I talked about the hand and the fingers. But there is something that unites us beyond our differences. If we can get closer to that, understand it, then our differences are more different expressions. And we can enrich ourselves through these different expressions. So I hope you tolerated me. I hope you found some value in the talk. It's a short talk, and we could talk a lot more about many different subjects in it. But I'll hand it back over to yourselves now. Have you any questions? So there's a question there from, let's see it. So why, in spite of so many years of prosperity, development of science and philosophy, the library of Alexandria was burnt and the city could not overcome fanaticism? I don't think it's got to do with science. The science that just if you have a library doesn't necessarily mean that it can overcome fanaticism, because if people are not educated to accept a different way of looking at things, then fanaticism can emerge in a society. Today we have lots of information. We have the internet. We have great repository of information, but at the same time we have fanatical behavior. So even though we have lots of information, lots of science, lots of knowledge, it doesn't necessarily mean that it would result in a more tolerant behavior, or a behavior of solidarity. Different philosophers suggest that to help to create those values, it's a more approach of education needs to emerge within society, where people are educated to be more, to bring out the best inside themselves, to know themselves, to awaken the universal values, to get closer to the truth. Once they do that, then we can see tolerance and solidarity emerge more. I hope that answers your question. How many Alexandrias have there been? I don't know. I think there were, I don't know. I've heard there was others. He set up other Alexandrias around the Mediterranean. So I'll just check my other document here to see I didn't miss anything. So there's a question here. Why do you think the people of Alexandria were able to have and maintain their tolerance for so long? I think it's got to do with the spirit and the vision that the Ptolemies continued in Alexandria. There was a thirst for knowledge, for different ways of looking at life, but through time, through the kind of the cycles of time, other forces emerged that that collided with that, and it wasn't that leadership, I don't think, was strong enough to help overcome that. Okay, so I don't think there's any other questions. Have a good day. It's still, sun's still out there. I thought it was going to be a foggy day or a cloudy day today, but it turned out to be very good. And I hope to see you all again. As Aidan mentioned, there's a foundation course online starting this Thursday, the 18th of June at 7:30. The first 3 talks are free, so I hope to see you there. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.